Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I wish it were under better circumstances that we could see familiar faces and come together to discuss important issues. I plan to speak for about 30, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions, comments, discussion after that. And we'll probably wrap up about noon. For students, I know you may have classes to get to, so please feel free to leave when you need to and to come and go. So for those that don't know, we decided to get right to it today without a lengthy introduction. But my name is Joel Toppen. I'm a associate professor of political science and teach global politics here at Hope College, and now in my 25th year doing that, which is hard to believe, and also a Hope College graduate of 1991. So I'll be trying to provide some context, some background, some analysis of the war in Ukraine. And then, as I said, then we'll have some time for discussion and questions after. So two things to begin, to start, that I want to just kind of lay out as we start. The first is that, as any student of human barbarism is well aware, war is hell. And so that's the case in Syria, that's the case in Yemen, that's the case wherever we see war, where we have it. And that is certainly the case in Ukraine. And so I will be providing some analysis, some perspective from a step removed. And so while I'm making that maybe cool analysis from a step back, I also want us to remember that we're talking about human suffering on a vast scale. And I don't want to ever, kind of forget that as I provide this analysis or perspective. And then the second thing that I want to begin with and throw out there to start is that as I tell my students, nobody ever started a war saying we're the bad guys, right? So for some of us, myself included, it's very clear in this instance, in this war, who the bad guys are, right? But we need to keep that in mind, except in maybe comic books. In comic books, maybe the villains are proud of their being villains and yeah, we're the villains, right? But in the real world, no one, as I'm aware of anyhow, has begun a war saying, hey, those are the good guys, let's go get them, right? We're the bad guys, all right? So I'll be trying to explain some of the reasoning or explanation of Russia's actions and Putin's aggression, not to be an apologist for Putin, but to try to provide some perspective and some explanation. Here is a map. We see this is right from The Economist magazine, and right before the war begins, when Russia was amassing troops along the border in Belarus, in Crimea. This is the Donbass region. In 2014, that was the last time that Russia invaded Ukraine. And in that military operation, the Crimean Peninsula was annexed and it is claimed by Russia to be a part of Russia. That has not been recognized by Ukraine or the US or the West. And then also beginning in 2014 in the Donbass region, the two republics, pro-Russian republics, separatist republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass region. Then there was a war that begins in 2014, and sometimes we call it a low intensity military conflict, but some 14,000 people have died as a result of this war. And so the dark blue line here that you can see is the line of separation between the pro-Russian, Russian-supported separatists in these regions, and then these are the rest of those republics. And so that conflict has been simmering since 2014. So the war begins, you could say, with the recent invasion in late February by Russian troops into Ukraine. But another perspective is that the war has been ongoing since 2014. And to provide some perspective, right? From Russia's perspective, this war and this conflict has much to do with NATO enlargement. Of course, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was created in 1949 as the Cold War was beginning, and it was largely a military alliance to offset the threat of the Soviet Union, part of the policy, the Cold War policy of containment. When the Cold War ends, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls down, Eastern Europe experiences democratic revolutions and throwing off communism and throwing off the Iron Curtain. NATO then begins to expand. In 1990, you see here, this is East Germany was the first, as we see German unification. And then in 1999, it's hard to read here, but it's Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary then join with NATO. It's important to realize and to remember that these countries were part of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was Russia's or the Soviet Union's answer to the NATO military alliance. And so they essentially have switched sides. From the perspective of Putin and the perspective of Russia, or at least the leadership, this was a threat. This is an obvious threat to Russia, and the West is encroaching, is moving closer and closer towards Russia's doorstep. And you see then here in 2004, we have a further expansion of NATO into the into the Baltic states. And the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania here were former republics of the Soviet Union. So not just they were part of the alliance, but they're actually part of the Soviet Union, and also expanding into Romania and Bulgaria at that time. So the former Soviet republics that were the last, from Putin's perspective, the last line of defense or the last bulwark against the encroaching NATO military alliance are Belarus, Ukraine here, and then also down here, Georgia. Right. So Putin has called the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991 into these 15 separate republics, independent republics, Ukraine being one of them, Russia, of course, being the biggest, that Putin has called this the greatest geostrategic catastrophe of the 20th century. Right? And so that includes World War I, that includes World War II, that includes the rise of Hitler and his attempt to dominate Europe and indeed much of the world. And so this is a great catastrophe for Putin and from his perspective. And so the enlargement or the encroachment of NATO, it just compounds this catastrophe. John Dower wrote a award-winning historic analysis, a book about Japan after World War II. And the book is called Embracing Defeat. And it's about how Japan had to pull itself together and rebuild its society after World War II. And he argues that they had to come to terms with the defeat in World War II. And it wasn't possible, he argues, for Japanese to say, politicians and others to say, we didn't really lose, right? Well, that's a perspective. They had to accept it and they had to come to terms with this defeat. And I would suggest that when it comes to this war in Ukraine, it's more evidence that Vladimir Putin has not embraced defeat, right? That he is trying in the Cold War, that during the Cold War, one side prevailed and one side was defeated. And Putin is trying to overturn the results, it seems, of the Cold War. He's trying to erase defeat rather than embrace defeat. And so the attempt is, from Putin's perspective, to rebuild or reclaim the Russian Empire, or what was the Soviet Empire, or Soviet and Russian spheres of influence. And so I'd like to kind of break down what's happening currently in terms of the war effort. We have at least 3 different battlefields that we can think of or conceptualize. So on the one hand, we have the military battlefield, the kind of traditional control for territory, fighting for control of cities, using traditional military weaponry, tanks, artillery, bombs, etc. So the military, kind of traditional military battlefield. And then we have an economic battlefield. And this is pretty unprecedented, the degree to which the United States and the West has put together a strong response to Russia's invasion in terms of an economic battlefield. The sanctions against Russia that we're seeing put in place are unprecedented. We have never seen a major economy face the types of economic sanctions that Russia is currently facing. They're broad-based. They will have wide support, particularly, of course, through Europe, and led by and organized by largely the United States, and in terms of these economic sanctions. And so when Putin had invaded countries in the past, had in 2014, for example, when he takes the Crimea and begins this war effort in the Donbass region, what we see is that economic sanctions were placed on Russia, but they were largely seen as kind of a slap on the wrist. Russia was kicked out of the G7, which then was the G8, when Russia was invited to join at the end of the Cold War, part of this effort to not necessarily stand everyone against Russia, but maybe try to bring Russia into the fold, into the community of nations. After the 2014 invasion, there were limited economic sanctions placed on Russia. And so it's widely expected, or it's widely thought, that Putin underestimated the response from the United States, from Europe, from the West, that he perhaps calculated that, when I invaded Georgia in 2008, slap on the wrist, essentially got away with it. When I invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed the Crimea, yeah, pretty much a slap on the wrist, mostly got away with it. In this case, that is not what we're seeing. So the sanctions and other economic penalties imposed upon Russia are significant and as I said, unprecedented for an economy of this size. So we've seen widespread, broad-based economic penalties, sanctions placed on North Korea, or also on Iran, but a major economy of the size of Russia, we really haven't seen this. So we're expecting, and we're seeing already immediately immense economic damage to Russia. The Russian central bank has predicted that the economy, Russia's economy, will shrink by 8% in this year 2022, and that's their estimate. Other economists, analysts have suggested that the contraction of the Russian economy could be as much as 20%. So this is a massive economic crisis for Putin. So there's the economic battlefield. I'll come back to some of the implications of the economic fallout of this war. And then the third battlefield that we can identify is the information battlefield or the propaganda battlefield. So control over the ideational space. And we see this especially in Russia, where a further limitation on the freedom of press, independent news outlets have been shuttered. And so we see an intense propaganda effort within Russia to kind of control the ideational battlefield or space here. A fourth potential battlefield, so we have the military, traditional territory, the economic, the ideational, or the propaganda, information battlefield. And a fourth potential battlefield is the area of cyber warfare. And I've frankly been a bit surprised how little effort on both sides we've seen in terms of cyber warfare. So we could, in the next few days, weeks, months, see an escalation in terms of cyber attacks by Russia or cyber attacks by the West. And so we have a kind of what is called hybrid warfare, where it's a mix of the traditional military operation with informational warfare, with cyber attacks, etc. A kind of 21st century type of warfare. And so there's much at stake, of course, in this war, and it's primarily a state versus state conflict here, traditional nation state versus nation state, Russia versus Ukraine. And so the future for these two nation states is on the line, is at stake. Will Crimea remain part of Russia? Will Ukraine be able to reclaim the Crimean Peninsula? What about the Donbass region? What about these so-called independent republics of Donetsk and Luhansk? Will Ukraine's democratic government even be able to survive? So much is at stake, of course, with Russia and Ukraine. But further, what is at stake? Many would argue, including President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Biden of the United States, what is really at stake is not just the future of Ukraine or the future of Russia and the survival of democracy in Ukraine, but what really, and the independence of Ukraine, but it's bigger than that, right? That the idea is that democracy itself is at stake, that here we have an authoritarian regime that is illegally and aggressively invading an independent democratic country. And this is a threat then not just to Ukraine's independence and democracy, but it is a threat indeed to democracy worldwide. And then also in terms of thinking about what's at stake in this conflict, we can see the framing of this in terms of the so-called liberal international order, or a rules-based order. And so what is the future of NATO? What is the future of the European Union? What is the future of the G7? These multinational institutions, which combined together make up what is called the liberal international order. Has it fulfilled its usefulness? And now we're in, well beyond the Cold War, and so perhaps the liberal international order will expire, and we'll see a new type of global order or lack thereof. So much is at stake. I want to bring us back to a little bit of the history here and background. So In 2004, Ukraine experiences the so-called Orange Revolution. This is part of the color revolutions of that era, of the middle part of that decade. And Ukraine experiences a revolution of sorts, a democratic revolution in 2004 after there were rigged elections in Ukraine, and people took to the streets, particularly in Kiev, and overturned the rigged results of the election. And so we have democracy kind of taking root, taking hold in Ukraine. In 2000, and then also the attempt, the beginning of a movement towards an orientation or a reorientation for Ukraine away from Russia, away from Russia's orbit or sphere of influence, and toward Europe, and promises and plans put in place for Ukraine to eventually join the European Union, to eventually join NATO as well. In 2013, or excuse me, in 2010 here, this is the election results in 2010. In the United States, we have red states and blue states. And in Ukraine, we have blue areas and yellow areas. And so in the election of 2010, you can see the blue areas primarily supported Viktor Yanukovych, and the yellow areas supported Tymoshenko. And so it's perhaps an oversimplification, but Yanukovych was pro-Russian or friendly to Russia, was Putin's guy in Ukraine, wanted to remain within the Russian sphere of influence, remain close have close ties and relations with Russia. And Tymoshenko represented the parts of Ukraine, mostly to the west, many younger folks who identify with Europe, who think of themselves as Europeans, who think that the future for Ukraine lies in Europe and not with Russia, that is the past, that's the authoritarian repressive past. And so again, there are other issues at play in terms of Ukrainian politics, but that is certainly a big part of it. So Yanukovych wins in 2010, in part with the help of Paul Manafort, who helped to run his campaign. And in 2013, then, an initial agreement was reached between Ukraine and the European Union. But the agreement was not signed, a trade agreement, closer relations, not that they were going to become at that time, full members of the European Union, but closer relations, and had this agreement worked out, a deal was reached. And then at the last moment, then Yanukovych decides, presumably under pressure from Vladimir Putin and from Russia, decides, no, in fact, we're not going to go ahead with this agreement with the European Union. Instead, we're going to reach a distinct separate agreement with Russia. And so a push against joining or becoming part of Europe formally, and moving back to closer relations with Russia. And so in 2014, then, this sparked a new widespread, massive protest movement, democracy movement in Ukraine. And so this is the Maidan Revolution, the Dignity Revolution of 2014. So a second kind of democratic revolution begins in 2014. Yanukovych goes on and on for weeks and even months, and more than 100 demonstrators were killed. The protests began peacefully, but then the government tried to put them down with the use of force and violence, and then eventually it backfired. And it just led to bigger crowds, rather than dispersing the crowds or putting down the demonstration and the protests. And eventually then Yanukovych flees Ukraine, and he flees to Moscow, where he's been living in exile ever since. And then so we have kind of a return, as it were, to the pre-Yanukovych presidency, or at least that part of his presidency. And we have governments put in place in Ukraine that are more pro-European and want to envision a future as being a full-fledged member of Europe, being a member of the European Union, being a member of NATO. So if you look at this map, one interesting thing that happens with the invasion in 2014, this is the Crimean Peninsula here. You can see it's blue, and it's dark blue. It's that the folks here are identify more with Russia than folks in the western part of the country who tend to be more Ukrainian speakers. And here we have Russian speakers. So essentially what happened when Ukraine is annexed by Russia is that Ukraine then becomes less pro-Russian and more pro-European, because this big chunk of Ukraine was annexed. And so their vote doesn't count in terms of the balance of power within Ukraine. And so we see that as kind of, I mean, we can see a little bit of the history repeating itself in terms of the more recent invasion. In that, instead of bringing the invasion, seems to have had the effect of, instead of bringing Ukraine back into the Russian fold or back into the Russian sphere of influence, it seems to have had the opposite effect of pushing Ukrainians away and saying, this is why we need to be a part of Europe. This is why we need to be a part of NATO. And so a strong resistance and pushback against the Russian aggression. And so I have a list here of the accomplishments, Putin's accomplishments of the war. And his accomplishments are the opposite, a long list. His accomplishments are the opposite of what his goals are or his stated interests are. So, for example, NATO. Putin would love for NATO to be split up, for NATO to dissolve, for NATO to become obsolete. And instead, the result of this invasion, of this war, has been to give NATO a new sense of purpose. NATO has not been this unified, perhaps in decades. And so, again, the opposite. Putin says that there is not really an independent Ukrainian national identity, that Ukraine is a part of Russia, and from his perspective has always been a part of Russia. All right. And what is one result of this is really the war and the invasion have forged, there was a sense of Ukrainian independent national identity, but now it's been really forged. And what does it mean to be a Ukrainian? What is the meaning of Ukrainian national identity? It seems to be, in large part, that means we're not Russian, right? That we are independent and we are Ukrainian and we are Europeans and we're not part of Russia or its sphere of influence. And also the idea of the liberal international order, you could argue, which has always been a threat to Putin, because from the beginnings in the 1940s, after the end of World War II, the Cold War is taking shape, is beginning. That's when the major institutions of the liberal international order are put into place: the United Nations, the IMF and the World Bank, the NATO alliance itself, the beginnings of a European community that eventually became the European Union. These elements have been seen as a threat to Vladimir Putin. So he would like to destroy NATO or weaken NATO. He'd like to divide Europe. He cheered the Brexit, right? That Europe, the European Union, seemed to be falling apart or breaking apart. And indeed, he would prefer that the entire liberal international order or rules-based international order, or he would say anti-Russian Western order, that this be weakened at least, if not completely destroyed. And so we could, you could argue that there's been essentially a snapback of the liberal international order, that, oh, this is why we need NATO. I just read a headline this morning on my way here that NATO has made an announcement that it has increased, it made promises to increase its military spending. President Biden has introduced a budget last few days that increases U.S. military spending by 10%. Germany has kind of decided on an about face. The new Chancellor Olaf Scholz has announced a major increase in Germany's military spending. This is not the goal of Vladimir Putin, right? He would prefer that not happen. So the result has been the opposite of his interests or of his goals. I'd like to make another point about the so-called democracy movements. So from Vladimir Putin's perspective, he does not believe that these mass movements for demanding democracy, demanding democratic reform of governments in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Georgia, he does not believe that they are homegrown or that they are organic. He believes that the United States and the West more generally is behind this, that they are pulling the strings, that they are fomenting these uprisings. And what is the purpose from Putin's perspective? The purpose is not to promote democracy or establish a democracy. It's not about freedom. From Putin's perspective, it's about challenging Russia, replacing regimes or governments that are pro-Russian with governments or regimes that are pro-US or allied with the West. And so he sees it through that strategic lens. So when we have the democratic revolutions of 1989, Putin sees that as a threat to Russia. When we see the color revolutions in Ukraine, Georgia, he sees that as a threat. When he sees the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011, he sees again the US and the West is trying to initiate regime change, replace pro or at least friendly regimes to Russia with regimes that are more in the allied with the US. And so this helps us to understand why Putin intervened in militarily in 2014 in Syria to prop up Assad, the dictator in Syria, who is friendly with Russia and the Russians. So when the U.S. And NATO intervened in Libya just previous as a part of the Arab Spring, invoking human rights, invoking a responsibility to protect against Gaddafi's atrocities against his own civilians, Putin said, really, all you're doing is you want to replace Gaddafi, who's an anti-Western leader, with a pro-Western government or regime in Libya. So when it came to invoking the R2P principle, the responsibility to protect in Syria, then Putin said, yeah, no, I'm not going to allow you to get away with it again. You got away with it in Libya, but I'm going to put my foot down as it relates to Syria. So these things, these democratic movements, pro-democracy movements that we see in Belarus, the dictator Lukashenko is still in power, but Putin sees these all as being, the strings are being pulled by the US and the West. This is not a homegrown, organic, grassroots pro-democracy movement in Belarus to try to throw off the dictator Lukashenko. Instead, Putin sees that as efforts by the United States to pull another former Soviet republic into its fold there. So when President Biden made a lot of headlines with his speech in Warsaw, is really a fascinating speech for many reasons. At the end of the speech, he said, of course, off script, ad lib, for God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power, right? And so advocating for regime change, right? I can't imagine being one of President Biden's speechwriters. Like, just read the speech, that's why we wrote it that way, right? So anyhow, and then of course the White House says, oh, there's no policy change. We're not advocating regime change. Our policy is not for regime change. No, he was just expressing, his personal kind of emotional reaction to the atrocities committed by the Russian invasion and by Putin. But it serves from the Russian perspective, it serves, oh, see, told you. All of this, ever since the end of the Cold War, it's all a bit about they're coming after Russia. They're coming after us. They want to destroy Russia. They want to knock me out of power, implement regime change. They want to destroy Russia and its government and its broader sphere of influence. I want to also make a point about U.S. foreign policy in this regard, and then I'll open it up for questions and comments. And see if I have this timeline I can put up here. No. Where did I? There we go. This is kind of a chronology of sorts to kind of put things in perspective. You see here at the bottom, in 2021, of course, the U.S. withdraws. You can't read that there, but the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so many observers, analysts contended that this was actually kind of spurred on Putin to say, oh, see, the United States, the West has lost its appetite for military intervention, and they're fine with letting the Taliban take over in Afghanistan. They want to be more isolationist, perhaps, or more withdrawn in terms of not getting militarily involved. On the other hand, it's the U.S. position as regards to Ukraine to not become military involved is fully consistent with the U.S. Policy announcement upon its withdrawal. And the Biden administration says we're going to rely less upon military intervention, upon military force. Yes, we want a strong military for deterrence purposes, but we're not going to rely upon this tool in terms of foreign policy, and instead rely and emphasize more diplomatic tools and also, importantly, economic tools and economic weapons. And so early on, as Russian troops began amassing at the border for Ukraine, the announcement was made by the Biden administration that we have no plans, zero plans, even if Putin invades Ukraine, we have no plans to become militarily involved. We will pursue economic weaponry and economic warfare against Russia. We will make Russia pay a price for its invasion of Ukraine. But the announcement and decision was made to not get militarily involved. Right? And so there's, whether it, for right or wrong, better or worse, you think it's right or wrong in terms of a policy position, it is consistent with that withdrawal to say, no, we're not going to use the military tool out of the toolbox. We're going to rely upon diplomacy and economic weapons. Now, many are saying, well, the economic sanctions and the threat of economic sanctions have failed because it hasn't deterred Putin. It hasn't changed. He went ahead with it and is still continuing. It sees no signs of saying, oh, you're right. I was wrong. We never should have invaded. All right, we'll withdraw. All right, that doesn't seem to be the case. And so many folks would say that the economic sanctions, they don't work, right? They're ineffective. Even though they're stronger this time than in previous instances, it still really amounts to a slap on the wrist. That it doesn't work in terms of deterring Russian aggression in this case. And I would just push back on that a little bit and ask, well, that's assuming, if you say they don't work, that's assuming that the purpose was to deter. And it may be that, no, the purpose is to punish. The purpose is not necessarily to deter, to prevent this invasion or to prevent this war, but in fact, just to make sure that the aggressor pays a very high cost in terms of the economic suffering and pain that will be felt by Russia. I have many other points to make, but I could go on and on. So I'll wrap it up now, and we'll see what kinds of comments or questions, thoughts you all have. Yes.
So why do you think that the response from the West is so much greater than like in Georgia or when they invaded Ukraine in 2000?
Yeah, that's a very great question. And it seems to have even surprised the West, right? And so in the run up, to the invasion, the Biden administration was saying they're going, the intelligence, our intelligence says they're going to invade. They're not just these aren't just exercises. All these, hundreds of thousands of troops on the border. They will invade. They're going to invade. And so we are going to respond with strong economic sanctions. And at the time, the thought process or the thinking was that the U.S. was ready to impose stricter, stronger sanctions than the Europeans, in part because Europe is so much more dependent upon Russia and particularly Russian oil and gas, so that they would be unwilling to impose such strong sanctions. And so, I've been surprised at the extent to which that these sanctions have been adopted broadly and embraced, even by Europe, who is paying a significant cost. Right, they're willing to suffer themselves in order to put this penalty upon Russia. And yeah, it's a great question, right? I mean, that would be a great doctoral dissertation topic, right? Why is it, right? What happened? And you can almost forgive Putin for thinking, right? Okay, based on prior experience, right? You got a slap on the wrist, and the sanctions aren't really that serious, and I'll get away with this just as I've gotten away with invasions and aggression, military aggression in the past. And yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that. Why this time? There's something about it. I think also that the leadership of Zelensky in Ukraine has helped, right? That he has been inspirational, has shown strong leadership, and has been a leader that the West, Europe, US, others can say, all right, we can feel good about getting behind him and rallying to his defense.
Who was in power in 2014?
In 2014 in Ukraine, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Zelensky had not yet been elected,
Okay.
right? But Yanukovych, there's a period of transition after Yanukovych flees. Yes.
It's very probable that Putin will only leave office in a coffin. And it's not nice to talk about assassination, but how angry are the oligarchs? And are they one of the best bets for something like that happening?
Yeah, that's who knows, right? It's like that's another great question that I really don't have an answer to. But yeah, part of the sanctions regime has been not just to sanction Russia or to sanction Putin or the government, but also the oligarchs seizing these, $100 million super yachts around the world, trying to make the 100 or so Russian oligarchs who support Putin to suffer, and that maybe then they will then put some pressure on Putin. There's no real way to tell. What we do know, or what we widely suspect, is that the kleptocracy that is at the heart of Putin's regime has involved all of these oligarchs. So he's made sure that they are that he's got dirt on all of the oligarchs, that they depend upon him. If they turn on him, then he can have many tools at his disposal to neutralize their objections, or whether that's through poisoning or imprisonment, we're not sure, but that to eliminate their political power within Russia. Yes.
Three pieces here. One, why do you think when Ukraine applied for NATO, they didn't admit them? Two, do you think at some point they will? And three, don't you think from Russia's perspective, if they're negotiating any peace, forbidding Ukraine to join NATO would be part of that negotiation?
Yeah, that's great questions. First of all, I don't think that Ukraine will join NATO. The NATO expansion, right, at the time, it was quite controversial even within the West, where realist scholars said, why do we need to expand NATO into these areas, right? That where liberal internationalists said, well, we want to extend the zone of the liberal international order. We want to bring these former communist countries kind of into the liberal international fold, whereas realists were more of the mind, this is unnecessary provocation of Russia. That this is you're poking the bear, as it was said, and so unnecessarily, there's nothing from a security perspective to be gained from that. The news yesterday that they've had these talks between Ukraine and Russia, and that Ukraine has evidently put on the table neutrality, right? That they will not pursue NATO membership, that they will remain neutral. However, the Zelensky government has said, but if we do that, then we need to have some sort of multilateral security guarantee from the West, from the US. So it's maybe, it's essentially the same thing. It doesn't really solve the problem. If there's a kind of a Article 5 type of agreement, that's the article within the NATO treaty that obliges member states to come to the defense of any member that has been attacked, this collective security arrangement. So if the security guarantees are essentially another Article 5, just in different language or in a different form, it doesn't really get, it doesn't really escape the fundamental problem and the fundamental problem is that if Ukraine has a security agreement, alliance, arrangement with the West, then that is a threat to Putin. And Putin sees that as a threat, that's not acceptable to Putin. And so that dilemma, I don't think, I don't think that gets resolved. I don't see how this ends well in terms of that. International relations scholars will call would refer to that as a security dilemma. It's a classic security dilemma. And a security dilemma is when one actor or nation state takes action to protect its own security, to provide for its own security in a defensive way, it necessarily results in the insecurity of others, right? So, and this explains the logic of arms races. Why do you have nuclear weapons, India? Pakistan says, and India says, just to protect ourselves. NATO is just defensive. This is only for defensive purposes. And the potential enemy or rival would say, I'm not so sure that's the case. So then Pakistan says, we better get our own nuclear weapons, right? So, and then that makes, India feel less secure or threatens the security of India. So yeah, that fundamental problem, I don't see how we escape that Ukraine is going to be seeking security guarantees, whether it's through NATO, whether it's through other means, seeking security guarantees from Europe, from the US, from the West, saying, see why we need that? Right? Russia has made its intentions clear. We need this protection. We need these security guarantees and arrangements. And then if that happens, then that will just serve for Putin, serve in his mind to say, see, they're aggressive. They're coming after me. They're moving closer and closer to Russia. This is an anti-Russian. This is not a defensive alliance, NATO. From his perspective, it's an aggressive anti-Russian alliance. And so I don't know. Yeah, that's you put your finger on something really important there. I don't know how we escape that dilemma.
What about the implications of China with Russia now?
Exactly. Great. That's a super question.
The impact of the sanctions.
Yes. And so China is kind of walking in a fine line right now, right? So China has aspirations to be a global leader, to set the rules of a future global order, right? Whereas Putin, Putin don't care, right? He's not seeking to be the leader of a global order. So if he's treated as a pariah by the West or by actors around the world, that's not a problem for him. Whereas China has aspirations to be the global leader and so does not want to be seen as an international pariah. So they've been somewhat supportive of Russia through this so far, but not 100%. And so we're not exactly clear how that's going to play out.
Financially, do you think that they're supporting what they're losing from the
Yes. So if for example, if Russia is selling less oil and gas to the West, they're selling maybe more now oil and gas to China. So China can be kind of act as a safety valve or to help blunt the power of the economic sanctions. Right? And so what is the extent to which the U.S. and the West will then turn to China and say, hey, right? But what we're seeing is a widespread decoupling of Russia's economy from the global economy, or at least the major parts of the global economy, Europe, Japan, the United States, the West. You have a question?
I guess like a main thing that has come to me like consistently as I've just been kind of taking all of this in is like, why is all of this happening now, and like to the extent that it is compared to the previous invasions?
Yeah.
And why did it just like, why did Putin decide like, oh yeah, like I want this to happen now in this?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Can you
So
repeat the question?
yeah, I'll repeat the question. Why now? Right? If the Cold War ended in 91, Putin takes power in 2000, right? And so 22 years ago, NATO expands even further in 2004, right? Invasion of Georgia 2008, invasion of Ukraine 2014. So this is ongoing, but why now? Why 2022 did he decide rather than 2021 or 2023 or 24 or 25? And that's a very good question. I think part of this has to do with what's been happening in Belarus. So the 2020 elections in Belarus were widely seen to be rigged by the last dictator of Europe, Lukashenko. Massive pro-democracy movement in Belarus. And so that might be also part of the kind of the impetus or the trigger, as you will, if you will. Russia, Putin sends in troops to support, to prop up Lukashenko. We don't know, of course, what the negotiations were, but I suspect that Putin said, "Okay, Lukashenko, I came to your aid. I helped prop you up to preserve your position of power against the widespread democracy movement, and so I'm going to need a favor. Now you're going to help me." So the Russian invasion of Ukraine didn't just come from Russia, but also significantly number of troops coming in from Belarus. And so that may be part of it as well. Also, since 2014, Russia has made a clear effort to create a fortress economy, a so-called fortress economy. So sanctions were put in place in 2014, and Putin says, okay, so we need to prop up our economy or build a fortress for our economy so that we can withstand these types of economic sanctions from the West the next time that they're put in place. And so it takes time to do that. So for one example of that is that Russia shifted much of its foreign reserves out of US dollars, out of euros, and into other currencies. And so to kind of thwart the power of US and euro sanctions against Russia. So that might be part of it as well. Others, of course, would say, that maybe the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan also helps to explain the timing, that the U.S. was signaling that, hey, we don't want to get involved militarily overseas, and so we're going to kind of retreat back to more of an isolationist perspective. Others, of course, critics of President Biden would say that the timing is because Biden is weak, and Biden has signaled weakness to Putin. And of course, former President Trump has said, if I were still president, right, this invasion wouldn't have happened, because Putin would have been more fearful of the response from the United States. Interestingly, John Bolton, the former national security advisor, Trump had many national security advisors, but Bolton was the longest serving of them. And Bolton responded to this argument by saying, yeah, because Putin didn't need to invade Ukraine while Trump was in office, because Trump was largely doing his work, right, that he didn't need to invade and push further. And that's perhaps a stretch, but if we think about it, here we had a president in terms of the Trump administration, a president, maybe not the administration, but a president at least, who was saying that the EU is a foe, right? Not a friend. That the EU, he didn't say enemy, but he did say the EU is a foe, and he celebrated the Brexit and celebrated kind of the dissolution of the European Union. President Trump, former President Trump, when he was a candidate, of course, famously claimed that NATO was obsolete, and he threatened to withdraw the United States from NATO. So Putin, of course, was celebrating that NATO seemed to be weakening, or at least the U.S. president was rhetorically weakening that alliance. And then also the G7, the group of seven richest, the G7 forms when the seven biggest economies in the world. But it's also important, I think, to note that the G7 is made up of democracies. So Japan, Canada, the United States, and then four Western European democracies, including the UK. And so, after the invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the G7 kicks Russia out, right? President Trump, during his time in office, said, oh, I think we ought to bring Russia back in to the G7. We ought to invite them back to the G8. So, you know, in terms of EU, NATO, G7, and the whole idea of the America First nationalists, a rejection of pursuing a liberal international order, that type of foreign policy, I think was consistent with Russia's goals. But it's an excellent question about, you know, why now? And I really don't have a better answer for you than I tried to provide. Yes, go ahead, Jim.
Joel, thank you so much. This has been an excellent presentation. I'm wondering what your thinking would be about the church in Russia and Ukraine with what happened. And I did not know this, but recently read that in 2019, the Ukrainian church was given independence from the Russian Orthodox Church, and that may play a role in the now of what's going on?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with kind of the inside story about all that, but the Ukrainian Orthodox Church gaining this kind of independence and independent recognition, I think is important part of the story. It's consistent with the rest of the story that Ukraine is moving away from Russia. So instead of being Ukrainian Orthodox being part of the Russian Orthodox Church, to say, no, we have this type of independence in 2019 that you mentioned. And I think it's all part of that story that serves as a threat to Putin, and that he doesn't want Ukraine to move away out of the Russian orbit or achieve some sort of independent identity apart from Russia. Yeah, go ahead, please.
While this has been going on, we've also noticed, even though this is being, the big narration is that this is a battle between autocracy and democracy. But we've also noticed at the same time in Europe, there's been a right-wing populist movement towards autocracy, particularly in Poland and Hungary and Turkey. And I guess my question to you is, what do you see as the future of that movement?
Yeah, I've read a lot about that very question about the future of populism in Europe. One thing, I don't have any crystal ball, unfortunately, on that. But one thing I think that is really interesting is how Poland is firmly in the Western fold, right, and has closely allied with Europe. Another thing that I had neglected to say earlier in terms of European unity is that the UK, even though they left the EU, which was celebrated by Putin, has now decided they're joining. They're not saying, okay, the EU, you do your sanctions, and we've got our own policy and our own interests. Right. Instead, they have kind of reunified, at least in terms of the pushback against Russia and its invasion. But yeah, the future of populism in Europe is how this war impacts that that's also one of the many things that is at stake here. And that's another great question. We've had some really great questions that I have not had really good answers for. One other thing I wanted to mention about the humanitarian conflict, though, that is maybe a little bit under the radar, the economic suffering. Yes, Russia will face severe economic consequences. The U.S., the West, have been willing to suffer some consequences themselves. Gas prices are going up, for example. We're all having to deal, not solely because of this invasion, but in part. And so we're all having to deal with that. But the World Food Program has recently announced, the UN agency has announced that we have an increasingly severe food insecurity crisis globally. Right. So, of course, Russia and Ukraine are important agricultural exporters. And so the price of food, not just in Ukraine or in Russia, the price of food globally has gone up. And this is a really dire problem for many countries outside of the region. In the Middle East, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, paying much more for basic food items and staples. And so, and also, Russia is an important exporter of fertilizer. And so the use of fertilizer globally, in terms of global food production, will decline. And then so it just makes sense that then yields will be lower than they otherwise would have been. That's why they use the fertilizer. And so that means that the supply of food in the future, next couple of years at least, will be smaller, and then that will drive up the price. So for those of us who maybe spend 5 or 10% of our budget on food costs, it's manageable. Yeah, we're paying more at the grocery store, it's manageable. But for folks around the world and poor countries where people are spending upwards of 50% of their income on food costs, then when those food costs go up, it's a much more severe impact for those folks. So the humanitarian crisis or the humanitarian tragedy is not just located in Ukraine or the economic pain and suffering that Russians will be experiencing, but it is indeed the humanitarian suffering will be global and worldwide. I'm going to stick around. It's 12:02 right now. We have one more question, and I'll be around if you want to ask more questions and have more conversation. But thank you all for coming. Go ahead, please.
People in previous administrations who've had personal contact with Putin, such as Condoleezza Rice, have commented that something about him has changed. Something is different. They can't put their finger on it, but they notice he doesn't seem to be the same person. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've read all those reports or that speculation as well. And then this morning, reading reports from Western intelligence services that Putin is not receiving truthful information from his intelligence services, from his military, that he's surrounded himself with yes men, with people who just tell him what he wants to hear. So his decision-making process is weakened because he's shielded himself from truthful information. So yeah, I mean, the part about Putin's well-being is that really we're talking about Russia, we're talking about the Russian government, but it's idiosyncratic. This is one person that is making these decisions. So the mental well-being of that one person is very important. And so I don't have any extra insight on that. I do want to say though that, all right, there's fear in the West of escalation. The Biden administration has been encouraged to put a no-fly zone, for example, in Ukraine. We don't have to join the fight 100% or fully, but we should at least enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine to protect Ukrainian civilians. The problem with that, of course, is that would require military action, direct military involvement, U.S. warplanes shooting Russian warplanes out of the sky, and then that is direct military conflict, no longer a Cold War. Now we're fighting through proxies, but now that's escalating to a hot war. And Vladimir Putin has, of course, been threatening the use of nuclear force and perhaps escalating to nuclear war. And so, well, I've heard folks say, yeah, but he won't really he's not going to he wouldn't do that, right? Come on, that's a stretch. Given what he's done so far, I don't have a lot of confidence in Putin's rationality, right? Or that he's going to exercise reasonable judgment. It seems to be he's showing recklessness, right? That through this war effort, and in terms of again, his accomplishment, he's destroyed Russia's economy. He's reunited NATO. Now we see protests against the war and against Putin in Russia. Right. And of course, part of his effort in 2016 to meddle in the U.S. election was not just to help the election of the campaign of Donald Trump, but it was also to divide Americans. Right. That was part of the goal, to split Americans against each other, to sow this division. Another accomplishment that we've seen from Putin is that the U.S. is unified. Washington, D.C. There's some, folks on the right, far right, Rand Pauls, and there's some folks on the left maybe who are not united on this. But for the most part, it's a bipartisan consensus in Washington that the U.S. needs to stand firm in supporting Ukraine. And so he's again achieved the opposite of what his interests or what his goals are. So it suggests a lack of reasonable, rational judgment on his part. So I will pray for his mental well-being for sure. Okay, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I'll stick around if you have questions. Thank you.